So under normal retirement, you earn 2% for each full year that you teach. So let's just say you taught 20 years, then you'd get 2% for each year that you taught. So you'd get 40% of your average salary in a pension benefit. So for normal retirement, you have to retire with 20 or more years of credited service in Connecticut public schools and be at least 60 years of age or older, or you have to have completed 35 years of credited service, at least 25 of which are in Connecticut public schools at any age.
Are you ready for a successful retirement? We're addressing the topics facing today's retirees. Welcome to Retire with Ryan. Now here's your host, Ryan Morrissey.
Welcome back. This week I'm addressing another listener question, and a listener wrote in and mentioned that they were a teacher in Connecticut, and through the end of the school year, they had 19 years teaching, and they had a two-part question. One, should they retire now? And secondly, with the options available to them, what payout options should they take? So I thought this would be a great time to go over three things that you should know if you're a teacher in Connecticut about the Connecticut Teachers Pension Plan. And if you've attended any of my live reviews, I probably have mentioned that my mom is a retired teacher, and I work with a number of teachers, some that are still working, some retired, and so I'm very familiar with the Connecticut Teachers Pension System. Three things that you should know are, how you earn credits, how your benefits are calculated, and what are the different options that you have available to actually collect your benefit when you start receiving them. So I'm going to go over all three of those on this episode. So number one, how do you earn credits? So the way that you earn credits is that each month that you teach, from September to June, you earn 1/10 of 1%. So a full year of teaching in Connecticut is equivalent to 1 credit. So if you don't teach a full year, let's say you only taught 6 months, then you would earn 0.6 credit for that year. And then you can't earn more than 10 months of credit in any school year. So I guess if you maybe teach summer school or do other work, you don't receive credit for that. And in order to receive the credit for that month, you must be employed on the first working day of that month in a Connecticut Teachers Retirement System eligible position. And you also have to be putting in the mandatory contribution into the pension plan. And I believe that every teacher now in Connecticut puts 8.5% of their pay in. I believe 7% goes into the pension system, and then 1.5% goes towards the health fund. So let's just say, for example, you started teaching on October 15th of a school year, and you worked until June 20th, which would be, for many schools, the last day of the year. Because you started in October on the 15th, you don't receive credit for that month, so you get credit from November into June, which would be 8 months. And let's just say you were going to retire partway into the year. Maybe you need just 4/10 of a credit to get you there. Then you'd want to work September, October, November, and then part of the way into December. Maybe you retired the week before Christmas, and now you've gotten your 4 credits that you need. And you can also buy back service credit from either teaching outside of Connecticut or in other positions. And I don't have time in this episode to get to that, so maybe another episode we'll talk about that. So the second thing you should know I mentioned is how are benefits calculated and the 4 ways that you can retire under the Connecticut Teachers Retirement System. So there are 4 different types of retirement. There's normal retirement, early retirement, pro-ratable retirement, and vested deferred retirement. I'm going to go over all 4 of these options. So under normal retirement, you earn 2% for each full year that you teach. So let's just say you taught 20 years, then you'd get 2% for each year that you taught. So you'd get 40% of your average salary in a pension benefit. So for normal retirement, you have to retire with 20 or more years of credited service in Connecticut public schools and be at least 60 years of age or older, or you have to have completed 35 years of credited service, at least 25 of which are in Connecticut public schools at any age. And the formula that is used to calculate your pension benefit under normal retirement is 2% times credited service in Connecticut public schools. So that would be the number of years that you taught, times the full-time equivalent, which I'll get to this in a minute, times your average final salary, which I'll also address in a minute, and that is your normal retirement. And the maximum benefit that you can receive is 75% of your average salary. And your benefit must commence by age 72. So that means that once you've hit 37 and a half years of teaching in Connecticut, it's probably time to retire. You can teach longer than that, but your pension benefit isn't actually increasing. And I mentioned a few minutes ago something called a full-time equivalent. So each year in December, you receive an annual statement from the Connecticut Teachers Retirement Board, and that'll show you how many years you've been teaching and how much you've earned for each year. And it'll also list on there the salary for that year, your contributions, as well as the employer's contributions, as well as any earnings, as well as the full-time equivalent. And what this has to do with is that if you teach part-time or if you're buying back any years, that full-time equivalent might not be one. So in that case, instead of getting 100% for that year, maybe you'd only get 80% or 90%. So to find that out, you need your statement to do that. And I also mentioned your final average salary in the calculation, and this is the average of your 3 highest years teaching. You can also get this off the annual statement, or you could look at your tax returns. But I find from working with teachers that the starting point usually in helping them figure out what they're eligible for is to get a copy of that annual statement. So don't throw that away. I would hold on to it until you get the next year's, and then you can throw it away, or maybe you want to save it. If you don't have an annual statement, you can actually request one online. I'll put a link in the show notes to where you can request your annual statement. And so the longer you teach, obviously you're continuing to earn credits, plus you're possibly increasing your average salary. And let's just assume that you started teaching right out of college at age 22. In order to retire under normal retirement, you'd need to work at least until age 57. And you could keep working up until the maximum, which would put you at age 59 and a half. But at that point, as I mentioned before, there's no increase in your pension. You're just possibly increasing your final average salary. And there's a calculator on the Connecticut Teachers Retirement Board website where you can enter in this information. You can enter in your 3 highest years of salary, plus the number of years of service, plus your full-time equivalent to see what your benefit look like. And some other stuff, if you're a Connecticut teacher to consult with, is definitely the Connecticut Teachers Retirement Board website is a great resource to go to. I go to it frequently when working with teachers, as well as reading the Connecticut Teachers Retirement System Active Handbook, which is about 50 pages, but it's a quick read. And I also put a link to that in the show notes as well. But it talks about more in depth about what I'm talking about and some things that I just don't have time to cover today. So early retirement would be that if you don't meet one of the 2 options for normal retirement, that you're not retiring after 60 with 20 years of service, or at any age with 35 years of service, then you might qualify for early retirement if you meet either of the 2 requirements: 25 years of credited service, at least 20 of which are in Connecticut, or attained the age of 55 and accumulated 20 years of service, with at least 15 of which are in Connecticut public schools. And the percentage that you receive in your formula, you won't get that full 2%, depends on how far away you are from normal retirement and the years of service that you have. So if you have less than 30 years of service, there's one chart that shows you what that percent will be. And then if you have more than 30 years of service, there's another chart. So this leads me back to my listener question earlier for my listener who mentioned that they have 19 years of teaching in Connecticut and they're age 64. So if you go to the Connecticut Teachers Retirement Board website and you find the chart, because they have less than 30 years, you'll see that they're 1 year away from hitting 20 years of service, which means instead of 2% per year for teaching, they'll receive 1.88. So this means that if they retire this year, 19 times 1.88 is 35.72%. So that's the benefit that they'll receive times their final average salary and their full-time equivalent. And if we just assume that their average final salary was $90,000 and their full-time equivalent was 100%, then they'd be eligible to receive, under Plan N, which I'll get to in a little bit, $32,148 a year. Definitely a very good pension. But if they kept teaching 1 more year, they would not get a reduction in their pension benefit. They'd get that full 2%. So that would increase their pension benefit to 40% using that same $90,000 average salary. That increases their annual pension to $36,000 a year. So that's almost $4,000 a year difference. And if we just assume that they live 25 years, that's about $100,000 of extra money they would receive by just deciding to work 1 more year. Now, I meet with a lot of teachers that more than ever, I think, are frustrated with teaching because of everything we've gone through with COVID and just because from what I've heard from my mom and other teachers, teaching has gotten a lot more difficult in recent years with just more requirements on teachers. But I would strongly encourage this listener to think about sticking out one more year and getting to that full 20 years so they don't receive this reduction in benefits because of the future money we know that they will give up, but also we're not taking into account any cost of living adjustments. And one nice thing about the Connecticut teachers pension system is there are annual cost of living adjustments. And so those will only amplify the amount of money that could be left behind by deciding to collect early. And if we even extrapolate this out a little for a more extreme example, but I've met with other teachers that have come to me wanting to retire after 15 years of teaching. They get into teaching as a second career, but that's even more extreme. If we go back to the chart, we see that if you teach for 15 years and you're over 60, you haven't met that 20 minimum requirement, you only receive 1.4% per year. So your pension is even further reduced. The third option that you could retire under is something called pro-ratable retirement. And you may qualify for this if you resign from teaching at age 60 and older, and you have a minimum of 10 years of teaching in Connecticut, but fewer than 20 years of total service. This benefit's a little more complicated. There's a few extra steps you have to do. So you first take the Connecticut service, divide by 10, then you multiply this times the years of service in Connecticut times the full-time equivalent plus 1% per year for any non-CT service, and that gives you your total service number. And then you multiply total service times final average salary times full-time equivalent, and this gives you your portable retirement benefit. I know it's complicated, but let's just work through an example here. So let's just say John retired at 62 with 15 years of service. And so we divide 15 by 10, that gives us 1.5. And we then multiply that times his full-time equivalent plus 1% for any teaching outside of Connecticut. So let's just say he taught 2 years outside of Connecticut, so he'd get 24.5%. So again, same example as before, he's getting a reduced pension benefit, and I would strongly encourage John to try to tough it out to 67 because now he's getting, instead of 24.5%, he's going to get 40% for his Connecticut teaching years, plus he'll receive 1% for any years teaching outside of Connecticut. And then the last option is something called a vested deferred retirement. And you may be eligible for this if you leave teaching in Connecticut before 60 and have accumulated at least 10 years of teaching in Connecticut. So essentially what you're doing is you're leaving your pension behind. You're not starting to collect it immediately, and you're deferring it until 60. And for some people, this might be an option. Maybe if you're leaving teaching and getting into another career and you don't need the pension to live on, then this could be a good option for you. But if you do need the pension to live on, then this is an option. Well, you'd have to seek early retirement. But again, the benefit of this is that there's possibly not as much of a reduction in teaching. So let me just walk through an example here. So if you would have reached 20 years of teaching by age 60, then use the same formula as normal retirement. So let's look at an example here. Let's just say Kelly left teaching at 47 and she had taught for 18 years and her full equivalent was 100%. So she'd receive 2% per year for her average salary times 18 years, which would be 36%. So there's no reduction. However, her pension doesn't start until 60. She wouldn't start collecting her pension at 47. If she wanted to collect her pension at 47, then we'd have to go back to that early retirement and, there'd be a significant reduction in that. But if you haven't taught in Connecticut for 20 years and you wouldn't have reached 20 years by the time you're 60, then we go back to that early retirement factor and that would be applied. We'll just look at Sue. Let's say Sue retired from teaching at 55 with 10 years of service, and we go back to that chart. If she's 10 years away from teaching, then she only gets 1.4% for each year that she taught. And that's only going to give her 14% of her average final salary, which is a significant reduction than if she could keep working those 20 years and get to that 40%. And one other thing I should note too is that, though I don't have time to discuss it today, as a Connecticut teacher, you don't pay into Social Security, so you'll receive little to nothing from it. And to offset this and really make your Connecticut pension plan work as much as it can for you, you want to at least get the minimum 20 years. If you get the minimum 20 years and you compare that to what you would receive from Social Security, most likely the Connecticut teacher's pension will be more. But if you work less than 20 years, it's most likely going to be less. And unless you go back to work and you start paying into Social Security, you're really being hurt by having gone into teaching and not seen it through and getting that full retirement benefit. The more you teach beyond 20 years, the more your pension benefit will be, and the more it will be worth it for you to receive this pension instead of Social Security. So this brings us to the third thing that you should know about the Connecticut Teachers Retirement System, and that is, what are the options available to you when you actually start collecting benefits and which one makes the most sense to you? So there's 3 options that you have available to you. There's Plan N, Plan C, and Plan D. And Plan N is what's known as a single life payout, which is what we're referencing when we're talking about these calculations where it's 2% per year times your full-time equivalent times your final average salary. That is Plan N. That'll give you the highest payout. However, with Plan N, that also does not guarantee that your spouse will receive anything from the plan should they outlive you. With Plan N, in the event of your death, let's just assume that you're married, your designated beneficiary, who would be your spouse, will receive a lump sum payment of your contributions and interest to date of your retirement, less 50% of the total payments received to your date of death. So let's just walk through an example. Let's just say at the time of your retirement, you had $350,000 in your membership account with Connecticut Teachers Retirement Board. And again, how to know how much you have in your membership account, that's reflected on your annual statement. And let's just assume you die after receiving $100,000 in total retirement benefits. So the amount that your beneficiary would receive would be determined as follows. So your starting account balance, which in this example is $350,000. Then you add up your total benefits received, which is $100,000, less half of that, which is $50,000. So that would leave $300,000 payable to your beneficiary. So it's easy once you get close to retiring to start doing some calculations to figure out what is the amount that you're going to retiring with in your membership account. And you factor out, okay, how much is your payment going to be? Then you can figure out how long you'd have to live to where your spouse or beneficiary would receive nothing. And if you figure that if you pass away and leave your beneficiary nothing, if they would be okay with that, then maybe Plan N makes the most sense. But if they would not be okay with that, then maybe you want to think about one of the other options. And that's where one of the other 2 options could make sense. So with Plan C, this is what's known as a period certain plan. And under this plan, same as within Plan D, you're taking a reduced amount as compared to Plan N. So you're not getting that full 2% for each year that you teach. You're getting a slightly reduced payout from that amount. And you have a few different guaranteed periods you could choose: 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, or 25 years. And what that means is that in the event that you pass away before the designated guaranteed period, so let's just say you choose a 20-year period certain and you pass away 15 years after receiving your benefits, then your beneficiary would receive remaining 5 years of payments because you haven't made it through the 20 years. So let's just say that you're getting $3,000 a month and you retire at age 60, and your benefit would be reduced down to about 95% of that. So you receive about $2,800 a month. So then your third option would be Plan D. And this is where you're choosing to leave a certain amount of your pension to your spouse as a survivor benefit. And you may choose to leave your spouse 100%, 75%, 66.6%, 50%, or 33.3%. So in the event that your spouse outlives you, depending on which option you choose, that's how much they would receive. So if you choose the 100% survivor option, this is going to reduce what you would receive versus Plan N, the single payout, the most, but it also leaves your spouse the most behind. And the further you reduce remaining amount to your spouse, the higher your payout will go. So the nice thing is that with looking at both Plan C and Plan D, even Plan N, when you use the calculator online, you can see clearly what all these options are, because this is based on not only your age at retirement with Plan D, but also your spouse's age. If you're married, you want to think carefully about which of these options that you should choose. Definitely Plan N gives you the highest payout, but there's a high probability that you might not leave anything to your spouse. And also keep in mind, you might leave them something, but the question is, can they replace what you're receiving from the amount that you're leaving behind to them? Chances are probably not. If you're getting $40,000 a year in a pension, even if you leave them a couple $100,000 behind, if you start doing some quick math, that $200,000, that $40,000 a year will only last 5 years. So if your spouse lives another 15 or 20 years beyond your passing, they're not going to be able to keep up with the amount of money that your pension was bringing in. So that's why you want to really think a lot about whether or not Plan D makes sense. And from the clients that I counsel, we look very in depth at this and go through their cash flow and expenses and run different scenarios to see if one spouse would be okay if the other one passed away and they lost their pension income. But the other thing you have to keep in mind too is that because of these, you're not paying in Social Security. There's also an impact if you outlive your spouse and you're collecting a pension from the Connecticut Teachers Retirement Board, that you won't actually get all of their Social Security survivor benefit. Now, there is some possible change to that, but you have to factor that in as well. And if you aren't familiar with either the government pension offset or the windfall elimination provision, they're the two things that apply to teachers in Social Security, I would go back to episode 38, how to apply for Social Security benefits, and I would check that out. So thank you so much for the listener question. I hope this covered what you were after. If anyone else has a listener question, you can go to retirewithryan.com. Then you can find the contact button in the menu, and on there, you can put in your name and your question, and I'll do my best to answer it in a future podcast. Also, if you haven't left me a review on Apple Podcasts, I would greatly appreciate that. Pull out your iPhone, search for Retire with Ryan in the Apple Podcast app, and scroll to the bottom where you can leave a review. Have a great week, and I look forward to talking to you next Wednesday. Take care.
You should consult a financial advisor familiar with your specific circumstances before you make any financial decisions. Nothing in this broadcast constitutes a solicitation for the sale or purchase of any securities. Any mention of rates of return are historical or hypothetical in nature and are not a guarantee of future returns. Ryan Morrissey, CFP, is an investment advisor representative of Morrissey Wealth Management, LLC, a registered investment advisor.